Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Welcome back to the Left Lens. We have a very special guest today. It's a very special roundtable, I should call it, because Margaret Kimberley is here, Black Agenda Report executive editor. And our special guest today is Garland Nixon, who is the host of the Critical Hour on Sputnik, but he is also quite active on both Rockfin and YouTube at Garland Nixon. And we have a lot to discuss with Garland. So good evening to both of you, and thanks so much for coming tonight.
Thanks for inviting me. I also have a show on WPFW 89.3 FM Pacifica in Washington, D.C. and KPFK 90.7 Pacifica in Los Angeles.
Garland is on the move. And so you know what to do while you are watching these streams. You want to like this stream. Make sure you're boosting this in the algorithm, sharing it, and of course, subscribing to the channel. Now, Garland, let's begin, because it has been a bit of a week or so for you. You had your Twitter account suspended, and we all know that Elon Musk is now the chief executive at Twitter. He purchased it for quite a handsome sum, over 40 billion. I believe it was 40 million US dollars. Where's it 40 billion? What's that?
44
billion. 44 billion US dollars. And he has championed himself as the crusader of free speech. He's been going after Apple. He's been doing all sorts of things, talking about Donald Trump, reinstating him. And then over this period, your account was permanently suspended, which is a hilarious term, because literally the word suspended means that there is an ending to it. But could you tell viewers here at the Left Lens what happened and why it happened, and anything else you'd like to add?
Sure. Well, I think the interesting thing about my particular permanent suspension, was that the tweet was like a couple weeks old. I had tweeted, towards Tony Blinken, and I did this satirical to-do list for Tony Blinken, and it was like blow up the Nord Stream 2, overthrow the government of Pakistan. Maybe it wasn't all that satirical afterwards, but you get my point. It was meant to be satirical, but now that I think of it, that was the problem. It wasn't really. But the last thing was strangle the Palestinians with your bare hands, right? So it was satirical, and it was, making the point of empire and the brutality of empire. Okay. And so I forgot about it. It was done. So I woke up one morning and about 9 o'clock, and there was a message that said, "You've been suspended for hateful conduct, but you can appeal." So I said, okay, let me try to appeal. When I went to click on submit, it said, oops, something went wrong. Try again later. And immediately an email popped up, and I looked at the email. It said, "You're suspended for good. And if you try to start another account, that'll be suspended," which eventually I did. I started another account. I called it Garland Nixon's Ghost, and that got suspended also. So but what's interesting is it like started a firestorm. People were calling me from all over the world. They were sending me links to like documents and articles that were written in other countries, and the discussion was very, very broad. And I think it was at the time because the discussion had been restoring suspended accounts. That, basically under Musk, people weren't saying you're suspending people. They were saying restore Trump, restore this person, restore that person. That was the discussion. And with me, it was very specifically what he said he wasn't going to do and why he said he was going to buy Twitter. It was clearly satire. It was clearly comedy. And it was aimed at the U.S. empire. It was aimed at specifically the State Department's foreign policy. And the punishment didn't fit the crime. Somebody does a satirical comment and you're going to suspend them for life. I can't think of any time in the past I've done something on Twitter where they had to suspend me or something like that. I don't know. I might have forgot, but for the most part, I've been on Twitter just tweeting away, doing a lot of comedy and satire. And it was like, okay, you get the death penalty. And that's exactly what he said he wasn't going to do.
Garland, it's interesting. Musk talks a lot about free speech, but I think it's pretty clear his idea of free speech is amplifying right-wing voices. But also Twitter still has this censorship issue going on. That's something that has not changed under his ownership. And I think we see again Black people on the left being treated the most harshly and being the ones who are going to be kicked off first. So those are my observations about your experience.
Oh yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it's not like, I think they looked at that and that there's no blue check mark. They look at it like, okay, this guy Garland, he's nobody. Now, what's interesting also is Dan Cohen, who's a investigative journalist, does brilliant work. He's been doing a lot of stuff on Haiti lately, and he uncovered, let's call it a plot, where these NAFO trolls who
Yep.
have been directly connected to the U.S. government intelligence community. So basically, some proxies for the U.S. government intelligence agencies apparently did this exercise where they all got together, they all filed a complaint against me, and when they got their response back that said, you filed a complaint against Garland Nixon, he's been kicked off Twitter, they all celebrated, hey, we got rid of this guy. So Twitter, actually, it wasn't like the algorithm got me. Somebody had to look at it. They got a bunch of complaints, but they know who these NAFO trolls are. And might I add, you're throwing me off for hateful conduct. I've had all kinds of hateful stuff from these NAFO trolls. So the people that are actually doing hateful conduct say, throw this guy off. They look at it, oh, a bunch of NAFO trolls don't like Garland Nixon, which means the intelligence community doesn't like Garland Nixon. Death penalty, Twitter death penalty he gets. And it kind of runs, afoul of Elon Musk claim that he's now Captain Free Speech, wearing a cape with a big C on his chest.
Yeah, I mean, the NAFO trolls. I mean, it's something that is quite obviously in operation, right? Because a lot of these trolls they're always very new accounts, and as you said, Dan Cohen did a whole exploration about how these forces are connected to the security state, and it's quite obvious because they emerged to literally champion NATO. I mean, there's not any clearer of an indication that something is a political operation than when you have a massive influx of social media accounts that do one thing and one thing only, which is to cheer on NATO's role in this Ukraine crisis. And back in April, right? Because myself on Twitter, my Twitter existence is tenuous because I got a second strike, so to speak, where I was taken down for like 12 hours unless I deleted a tweet, and it was about Taiwan. And there's a similar thing that happens when you talk not Taiwan. I mean, I talked about Tiananmen Square, the Tiananmen Square incident. So a similar thing happens when you touch on these certain issues. There will be an influx of accounts that mass report you. I think for some posts about Ukraine, about Taiwan, about Tiananmen Square, there's something like sometimes 10, 15 reports that are just reported back by German law that will say your account has been reported. And sometimes they're successful. And so, yeah, I was locked out for 12 hours unless I deleted my tweet. And if I didn't do that, it's unclear. So literally in fine print, it says next time you're permanently suspended. So that just tells you what you need to know about how Twitter operates. And it hasn't really changed under Elon Musk. I mean, Elon Musk has changed things, so to speak. Twitter Blue was not necessarily his. Of course, he made some tweaks to it to make even more money. But for the most part, Twitter has remained very much the same, with supposed changes to come, some of which are supposed to bring back certain accounts. But I don't see Scott Ritter coming back. I don't see a lot of different. I don't see Garland Nixon coming back. Like it doesn't seem like there's much motivation there, and it's quite obvious why. And it's because people like you, Garland, you speak out against the war machine, and Twitter in Silicon Valley is very much embedded in this machinery, literally to the point where there are national security State Department funded think tanks that partner with Twitter, like Australian Strategic Policy Institute, to do exactly what happened to you, to track down accounts that are saying the wrong thing and then to get rid of them. I don't know if
And
you want to comment on that, or
I just,
Margaret, you can.
yeah, just very, very quickly, let's not forget Musk's connections with the U.S. security state. He has contracts with the government, and so he plays this role, and I see it as a role, as being this outsider guy when he's very much the insider. I mean, SpaceX, does SpaceX exist without government contracts? No, it does not. So, what do you think about all that, Garland?
Well, I like to use this word a lot, illusion. In that, like, you got Sanders and these people who create the illusion of a left flank on the Democratic Party, and they go along with everything. You've got these leaders in the EU that create the illusion of independence and sovereignty when the European countries are really just complete vassal states that are committing economic suicide, right? And I think you have someone what Musk is doing currently. Look, for all I know, we could wake up tomorrow or Friday and he could say, look, I said I was going to bring everybody back who didn't commit a crime or egregious spam, which is what he said. He could do it. But as of now, he's working to create the illusion of free speech. Because what is it about? Well, here's all people want to know. Children want to know when they're home with their kids, with their parents. What are the third rails? What is it that I can and can't say? That's
Right.
what humans look for. We always want to know, what are the third rails? What is it we can't step on, right? And so we're looking at Twitter and we're saying the third rails were controlled by the national security state. Ultimately, the U.S. State Department. The third rails were imperialism, neoliberalism. You know what I mean? It was the foundation of this empire. Those were the third rails, we knew. And he claimed that he was coming in, and he claims he's going to do away with the third rails. We can talk about just about everything we want, but as of now, as of so far, those third rails that are the ones of consequence, and it wouldn't surprise me if he does when it comes to COVID. You know what? Go ahead. Talk about vaccines, smack-scenes, whatever you want. Talk about that stuff, because let's face it, according to Joe Biden, the COVID thing is over, and they've moved. Clearly, the people in power have moved on from that. They got bigger fish to fry. So he may just say, you can say whatever you want about COVID. Now, if you start pushing back on U.S. foreign policy imperialism, we're going to have a problem. And he's hoping he can just get rid of people like me, and nobody will really notice, because he brought back Trump.
Yeah, and bringing back Donald Trump too was sort of it was, of course, a huge deal in the Twitter sphere and in social media and in the larger mainstream media, because of Trump derangement syndrome that the liberal class has been battling with, or not so much battling, succumbing to, for so many years now. 7 years now? But it was sort of it was low-hanging fruit for Elon Musk, because not only did most Twitter users want it from his poll, or at least most people that took his poll, but there's also the fact that Donald Trump doesn't use Twitter anymore. He's been brought back and he doesn't use it. He uses Truth Social, which is his own pet investment project, and a lot of his political capital is now attached to that move. So he's likely not going to use Twitter. So Elon Musk doesn't really lose much from that, because it's a story that happened and now it's over. But for a lot of us, for people like you, Garland, there really is this chilling effect. I won't say their names, but I've had people tell me that because of this development, because of this censorship, people do watch what they say. They change how they say things. Sometimes they don't touch certain topics at all. So it actually does have a pretty profound effect, especially given how monopolized or how much of a monopoly these big tech Silicon Valley corporations have now on all forms of media, because this is the most important form of media now. No one except those who are homebound at this point watch mainstream, US mainstream corporate media. They don't, CNN, MSNBC, they're no longer something that's popular, and they struggle on social media. They don't really know how to do it. And so, and they don't really want to be on it, because there's a lot of people that dislike them, and social media gives people who dislike you a really big platform to show it. So there is an impact with this, and I think that's often not talked about, and it's had an impact on your work. It's had an impact on all of our work. So I just want to say that before kicking it back, Garland. Anything else you'd like to add, or
Yeah, sure. And there's some kind of fundamental questions that are raised here, and I think some of them we already have a pretty good idea of what the answers are. But when you look at the Bezos, when you look at these richest people in the world, right, in the US, in this particular system that we're in, they're going to be feeding at the public trough. If you're really, really rich now, you're going to be getting a whole lot of it from government contracts. That's the way it is. That's the way this system works, right? And so the question becomes, how compromised are all of these wealthy people? Yes, people talk about how powerful and how rich and powerful Bates or Bill Gates or whoever Bezos or Elon Musk is, but ultimately, their money always comes back to the government and these gigantic government contracts. So how much power does he really have? Isn't it quite possible, one may even argue probable, that the US State Department, the Pentagon, can exercise veto power on his platform and anything else he has anytime they want? SpaceX was going under at one point. They couldn't even make their monthly payroll. NASA came in and gave them a $1.6 billion contract. Now they can make out of the blue, hey, here's a $1.6 billion contract. They bailed them out. So you've been bailed out by the government. He can say what he's going to do, but ultimately you have to believe that if the people from the Pentagon, et cetera, call and say, look, dude, it ain't happening. I know you want to do this, but you can't. That A, he won't, and B, he'll keep his mouth shut and he'll continue to try to pretend like he has all of this power, but they're all so economically compromised by their ties to government contract that even if he wanted to do the right thing, I have great pause as to whether he would be allowed to do it.
But, Garland, I think what you said just speaks to the degree of collusion between the Musks of the world and the state. And this is true internationally. So is the state more powerful, but did the Musks and his ilk, are they equally powerful? Does the state also go along with them when it's convenient for them to do so? It's just an unholy alliance, and it keeps us from getting what we really need, which is unfiltered, independent news. We are dependent on all these corporate entities who are tied up with the state. I mean, I believe that all these platforms should be treated as public utilities, and they should be regulated not for content, but there should be a very clear rule about who's allowed on and who's kicked off and under what criteria. I really think that is the answer, but that's the last thing that any of these people that we've been discussing want to see. So we're all in this weird relationship with these people and entities that are basically corrupt. Except to do what we do, we have to be a part of some of those platforms. But I think it speaks to the control that we all live under, corporate control, billionaire rule, that is making life so problematic for us in so many different ways.
Yeah, and you make a great point, because that like incestuous relationship between these billionaires and the social media platforms and the government policy, there is a system, a clear neoliberal capitalist system, and that system is what allows the Elon Musks of the world and the Northrop Grummans and all of it. That's what they all eat off of. They all live off of this system. The problem that they have, and I think this is why this is an important discussion, is that their narratives are very brittle. They're very simple, and they can't stand up to a epistemological discussion. How do you know what you know? They can't have that conversation. And once people get beyond the superficial discussion and start saying, let's add historical context to this discussion about Ukraine or Taiwan, let's look, and why is it that Russia or China is so concerned? What's happened in the past that would give them great pause about seeing the United States come right up to their border, things of that nature. Those are more intellectual conversations that we need to have. However, those are the very conversations that they can't afford, because then their simplistic narratives will fall apart. So now Elon Musk has a hold of this thing that they give us a cover story to say, we've got to protect you from misinformation and disinformation, when the truth of it is they use these to protect their propaganda, so that they can continue lying to the American people and the rest of the people about what they're doing, and claiming that they're in it for good, when in reality, this is all about theft and imperialist theft and robbery.
Garland, speaking of propaganda and imperialist robbery, we have a pretty fast-moving situation, and you've been covering this quite extensively on your programs, all of your programs. This Russia-Ukraine conflict, for lack of a better term, or this proxy war on Russia being waged in Ukraine. And I wanted to ask, because we've had some developments. We have Russia making really, I think, significant gains in Bakhmut. We have also a lot of European developments, and I know you have a lot to say about the European Union and its master, its daddy, the United States. But you have now EU officials, Emmanuel Macron and others, who have come out and said, well, we're unhappy that the US is profiting from this war and kind of leaving Europe high and dry, like literally dry, when it comes to energy and when it comes to investments. When it comes to their economy, there's massive deindustrialization already happening. There's winter is coming, and winter is also coming for Ukraine, because earlier this month, just about less than a week ago, but this has been happening since October, Russia has been launching missile strikes, and those missiles have essentially taken out much of Ukraine's power system. And so this is a pretty intense situation going on. I wonder what your thoughts are today at this moment about it, and what you think people should be thinking about as this conflict continues forward.
Oh my gosh, there's so much, but something I've been talking about a lot lately, and that is the dynamics of power between the US and its vassals in Europe. One of the things that happened, I think, post World War II, is there was an unspoken agreement in a way. And that was, the Soviet Union basically said, we're taking Eastern Europe, we're going to have this buffer zone, but they didn't have any pretense. They said, we're taking this, we're going to hold it as a buffer zone, it's ours. We're not going to pretend like they're independent sovereign states, they're part of the Soviet Union. Okay. The US empire then said, we're going to take Western Europe. However, we've got to pretend that they're independent sovereign states. So we're going to continue to give them the pretense. We're going to put bases. We're going to use them as we see fit. But we got to have the people thinking that they're independent and sovereign. And you can look at instance after instance that clearly demonstrates they're not. But now the US empire feels threatened by the rise of Russia and China and Iran. And the world is changing. Modernity, other countries, imagine that, are growing and looking out for their own economic interests. And some of them are having some success, particularly with other systems other than neoliberal capitalism. That's very problematic for the US empire. So they can't afford the illusion of democracy anymore. So they're just like, okay, you know what we're going to have to do? We want to confront China, but we got to have industry, because all we've got is like magic asset-backed securities and stuff. What we'll do is we'll shut the tap off for Europe's cheap energy, and we'll steal all of their industry. Now, the job of the elite ruling class, vassal governors, whatever you want to call them, viceroys in Europe, their job, and they know it, is to maintain the illusion to the citizens of Europe that they are actually presidents and prime ministers, and they're actually in charge, and that they're independent sovereign nations. And now they're caught on this tightrope where they still have to try to pretend to their citizens like they represent them, rather than the neocons in Washington, D.C., as the people in Washington, D.C. make it difficult for them, because they're like, come on, guys, you got to hand us a crumb or something like that. These people they're not buying into the game anymore. They figured this out. And Washington, D.C. is just like, we don't care. We're taking your industry. We're going to throw you to the dogs. We could care less. It's your problem. You understood this game going in. You're the elite ruling class, Macron, Schultz, Sunak, Smoonak, whoever the hell. Your job is to keep your mouth shut and deliver everything that we ask you. And you're doing that. And now if you got to deal with it, who cares? That's your problem. Ultimately, because the way the leaders in Europe see it is, hey, at the end of this thing, somewhere a few miles south of Miami, I get a villa in a gated community, and the people back in Europe will be, running around like some, Dawn of the Dead 3 or something. And so that's kind of where I'm watching the elite ruling class in Europe twist in the wind as they try to figure out. Now we're supposed to believe that they suddenly just now, they figured out that the U.S. is stealing all of their industry, selling them gas for 4 times the price that they really should, and forcing them to spend all of their money on weapons, and that they suddenly figured that out. They're smart people. They're not stupid. But now the problem is the people under them are looking at them, asking them questions, and now they have to pretend that they're barking back at the United States. And as winter comes, that pretense is going to get thinner and thinner.
It's very funny. You said what I just said, what I have been thinking. Macron, after a full year, actually after years of this, of the U.S. undermining them, the thing that makes most sense for Europe is to keep getting natural gas from Russia. That's the logical thing for them to do. But the U.S. has always stood in the way. So they knew this was coming. This was the year when it all came to a head. And now this week they want to pretend, oh my God, the U.S. wants to force us to buy fracked gas. We can't believe it. And it's a bad performance. But to your point, they have dug this hole for themselves. They have been. It's kind of like the mafia, in like the movie Goodfellas, where the big mobsters they were allegedly protecting businesses, and they just robbed them and then destroyed them. And that's where Europe is now. I mean, even after the U.S. blew up the pipeline, I mean, everybody knows. Who else would have done it? Who has been opposed to Nord Stream all of these years except the U.S.? But they go along. They say, well, we can't reveal what we found. And if they ever reveal anything, they'll try to tell you that Russia blew up their own pipeline.
Right.
But this is quite a moment we're in. I don't know how much we want to go into it, but the creation of the EU is also responsible for this. These states have given up their sovereignty to this formation that was used basically to move capital around from one country to the next, and to move cheap labor from poorer European countries to wealthier European countries. But now it's all come to a head. But having given up their sovereignty, their people have given up their rights too. They are protesting. There are a lot of protests all over Europe. They're not. They don't tell us about it, or they'll say what's a far right protest, as if to, deprive them of legitimacy. Not people saying, wait a minute, the energy prices have gone through the roof, people losing jobs, going out of business, all kinds of things. But it's funny, everything we were told about the Soviet Union may in fact be true about the U.S., that these little vassal countries don't dare speak out, don't dare stand up for themselves. And we are seeing the Biden administration bring all of these crises, all of these contradictions to a head, while simultaneously trying to start something with China. And we hear these opinion makers saying we can fight Russia and China at the same time. I mean, it's madness. It's absolute lunacy. But that's the state that Europe is in, and that people here in the U.S. are in as well.
Well, the interesting thing I think about one of the things that we're learning about is both China and NATO, and that is, excuse me, both EU and NATO, the EU and NATO, and that is they're both American projects, and they're the exact same thing. The EU is an umbrella organization that the United States can bring all its vassals. It doesn't have to call them one at a time, bring them all together under this umbrella organization, and assume full control of their domestic and cultural policies. And NATO, they bring them all together and they assume full control for their foreign policy. So that's all it was. And I tell you, to me, what I think is the evidence of that: Brexit. The UK was like, yes, Brexit. All we got to do is get out from under the EU, and then because what were they looking for? The people kind of intuitively recognized that they didn't have sovereignty. Brexit was all about some true sovereignty. They got out from under Brexit, and they're even worse off than they were before. Because the issue was never about the EU. It wasn't about France. It wasn't about trade. It was about not sovereignty under the EU. It was about sovereignty under the US empire. So now that they're not under the EU, they're not under that collective umbrella organization that the US controls. The US now says, okay, well, we'll just keep our hand on you right here and keep you at our left hand and yank on your chain anytime we want. And so now they're waking up to realize they have even less sovereignty than they did. At least when they were in the EU, they could hide, kind of like puppies, all like fish in the school. They all hide together. It's hard to eat them all. You can get one at a time. At least they can hide with the group. Now they're out there individually. They got Richie Sunak, who is a embarrassing figure to me. Embarrassing. I look at him and I'm like, I mean, let's be honest. They're just keeping him there until they can find an Anglo-Saxon person to put in the seat. They're like, let's put this brown guy here.
Yeah.
We'll make it look good. Shut up and do what you're told. And then when we can find like an Anglo-Saxon person that we'll come with, we'll replace you. I mean, he was brought in a coup of sorts, over just an absolutely, bungling idiot. But at any rate, so that's where the EU is now. It's the issue there is sovereignty. And I think here's the interesting thing. And I wonder what you guys think about this. You've got these right-wing groups, these right-wing projects, like in Italy, Maloney or what have you, that are winning, right? And that if you look to the future, I would have to suspect that some of these are going to win. And people are saying, well, you can't let them win because that's fascism. Now, don't get me wrong, not a fan of them at all. But what they got now is fascism. It's a different kind of fascism. It's a different flavor of fascism, but clearly these neocons are fascists. These ultra liberals, you've got the ultra nationalists on the right versus the ultra liberals, but it's a different brand of fascism. It's more, I think what they're going to get is more of a non-interventionalist, a nationalist that says, we only want to deal with ourselves and forget it. We don't want to get involved. Like the traditional kind of conservative right-wing nationalists that are non-interventionalists, I think you'll see some. I'm not saying they're going to be good or I'm in favor of them. I'm just saying it's a different brand. And when someone says to me, I'm scared of them because they're fascists, I'm like, yeah, I'm looking up in the sky every night wondering if the missiles are going to come whistling down to take me out because of the fascists in here now. So, I don't know. What do you guys think of that?
Well, I can begin, and then Margaret, I'll kick it to you because the interviewee becomes the interviewer, and I like this. I like this. This is a good question. I mean, for me, you said it. When you said the word brand, I think that is very important because it's quite obvious that regardless of how the political establishment in Europe, in the United States frames itself, they end up doing very similar things. Now, one unique element of Europe is that there was fascism in Europe. And so there's kind of a unique history where it's like the Social Democrats, the neocons. There's kind of like this alliance of a brand that's an illusory democracy. And as that has crumbled, as there has been crisis after crisis after crisis, beginning with austerity, which the EU says, oh my gosh, I can't believe austerity now because of the United States and what they're doing with Ukraine. I mean, anyone who's been paying attention, anyone who lives in Europe, who's not of the elite, anyone who pays attention to politics in Europe knows that that's just not the case. The austerity has been happening for decades. Neoliberalism has been happening for decades. But now it's getting to the point where, yes, far right forces are getting stronger. And in my opinion, it's not so much about whether we support them or whether we don't, whether they take certain positions that are obviously correct versus ones that, of course, are just obviously problematic. The question is, well, what is the driving force of all of this? Why is this happening? Well, it's because the neocons, the social democrats, the liberals, they've smashed the left. They have done everything they can to destroy the left in Europe. And of course, we in the United States know what that is like all too well. And so that has allowed this kind of political vacuum to happen, where of course far right forces are going to take advantage of that. And I don't think it's whether they're correct or not. Of course, when they have the same policies as the establishment and they start doing, enacting their agenda politically and economically, then of course we're going to oppose it. But at the same time, objective forces are objective forces, and the motion of history is going to remain this way unless we can actually begin to hold and critique and attack those forces that are allowing all of this to happen, and that those are the neoliberal elites, the ruling class, the ruling class proper. But I'll kick it to Margaret because I know that you probably have a lot
Oh,
to say too.
I appreciate what you said about the lack of a left in Europe. That is a huge problem. Um, but that's not by, as you also said, that's not um, by accident either. It's been very deliberate. But I also think that we have to say, and Europeans need to understand, they're now having the experience that people in the rest of the world have always had. They're being treated the way people in the global south are treated. The US and its friends will say that we're going to try to smash socialism in Venezuela, or we're going to sanction this country and starve people, or we're going to use proxies to undermine this government, or we're going to invade this place or interfere in that place. Now they are living through in a very obvious way what their governments have done around the world for decades. And it's unfortunate that there's no left to explain this, and that the nature abhors a vacuum, and that's where the Maloney's come in, like the new prime minister of Italy, for example. But I don't think we should let the people of Europe off the hook either. I want I want everybody in the world to live in a nation that's sovereign and to be able to have the things they want for their people, but their governments have around the world kept other people from having their needs met. So I would point that out too, but unfortunately, without any left analysis to explain this, you get a Brexit, you get Maloney, and you get out and out support for fascists, like denial that Ukrainians who are running around, they always have a swastika tattoo or the Azov battalion. I mean, it's very open. And if you point out, look, there's a swastika, it's like, oh, that's Russian propaganda. It's like, no, it's like the millionth person I've seen with the swastika tattoo.
Margaret, if you put on Twitter, if you say Zelensky's name in any critical way like that, you will be reported. Like, that's how bad it is. Like, that's how much of a reaction there is to.
I have been reported also, and I've been swarmed by the NAFO people, and I think they also serve the purpose of just annoying people. So, trying to prevent you from addressing certain issues. So you have a kind of fascism, but then you have this very obvious support for a fascist government, an undemocratic government that outlaws its opposition, that outlawed collective bargaining rights. And we're told the democratic thing to do is to give these forces billions of dollars, and we haven't talked about, I guess the Europeans are the canary in the coal mine, but we're the ones hurting too. That we're told we can't have any of the things we need, but the Ukrainian government, and I know people who, God bless them, they mean well, and they're like, oh, I want to give to Ukraine. And I tell them, if you pay taxes, you gave to Ukraine. There's nothing for you to give to. But we suffer as well. And are propagandized and don't even know it. So Russia never saw the day that its propaganda was as slick as what we're dealing with here. But I just wanted to point that out about Europe and its history and how it's treated people around the world.
Well, I would say this: you didn't give to Ukraine. Theoretically, your money passed through Ukraine on the way to the shell companies for the
Yeah.
various billionaires in Europe that are really cashing in FTX and those. That's obviously there's some miscreant activity afoot there, to say the least. You bring up a good point. I just thought about, Margaret, and it's very important, and that is the importance of who do you align with, right? And that is, here's the interesting thing. So what we heard was Viktor Orban is so far to the right that the EU leaders they find him distasteful. He's a far right wing. He's a fanatic. He's a madman. He's a far right wing, right? But who are they aligned with? The same people who said Viktor Orban is so far to the right, he's distasteful. They don't even want to talk to him. He's unthinkable. Are aligned with people who are covered with swastika tattoos, who are yelling Sieg Heil, black sun, and every goose stepping all over creation, screaming as loud as they can when the U.S. empire says these aren't Nazis, and they're like, "Oh, shut up! Yes, we are. What are you talking about? Come on, give us our props. We're Nazis and we're proud, right?" So what's interesting is looking at the people who are like, Orban's too far to the right. We can't align with him, but we can align with people who make him seem like, Fidel Castro for Che Guevara, for God's sake, compared to these people. And you look at the Orban right? And the Orban right has kind of aligned with a practical political, where they're like, look, we may not agree on a lot of stuff here. And I'm not defending Orban. I'm just trying to understand this, and you guys can comment on this. But we got to eat and we got to stay warm. And so all this talk of Ukraine and Russia and who you're mad at and ideological stuff is all good and fine. But in my particular country, we're just trying to eat. We're trying to stay warm. We're trying to just make it another day. And we don't want to do these stupid ideological things you're doing. And if you ask me, I mean, I'm not trying to defend Orban. He's way to the right of me. I'm, way over here to the left. But my point being, looking at who these neoliberals align with, it's interesting to watch them argue that this guy right here to the right's too far and align with the most extreme version of fascism that this world has ever seen. People that are so proud of it that they have to lie, that they literally, the U.S. government went in and they told the Azov people, you got to change your patch. I mean, this is a little too obvious. You got like all kinds of Nazi stuff on here, all the iconography of Hitler. Okay, you can't take your shirt off because you're covered with swastika tattoos, but at least, make your patch look presentable. And that's who they're comfortable with. Interesting things when you look at who's aligning with who.
Yeah. And definitely let's maybe Margaret and I'll just say something really quick to this, and then Margaret, if you have anything to add, and then we can get to, because I definitely want to get to China and Taiwan. But I mean, what you're saying is important, because it feels like the only time that mainstream Western media, the U.S. political class, NATO, the only time they have a problem with the right is when countries like Hungary actually begin to assert some kind of sovereignty and start to align with the multipolar world. I mean, look at Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is objectively one of the most repressive governments in the world. Objectively, I mean, there's no way we can avoid that one. But at the same time, the only time that the United States has expressed problems with Saudi Arabia is when Saudi Arabia says, yeah, maybe I shouldn't step on Russia's feet. Maybe I should join BRICS because we have a lot of energy. They have a lot of energy. The market is very volatile. The US and the EU are doing all this kind of wild stuff. And maybe it's time to diversify the portfolio. That's the only time they have problems. The United States, the neoliberals are with Saudi. I mean, Saudi Arabia just got a pass for Khashoggi, and that's, that was kind of a very menial story, honestly. It really didn't get much attention at all. But Saudi Arabia got a lot of attention after they bumped fists not too long ago, Biden and MBS. Suddenly, MBS is like, well, we've been watching what's going on with Ukraine. We've been watching what's going on with this energy crisis. I don't know if we want to go completely and utterly down the path of vassalage to the United States, and that just angered Biden a lot. And so to this day, now now they will. Although there was almost a clemency given around Khashoggi, at the same time, there's still a lot of problems there. So I'll just say that to say that the only time the U.S. actually speaks about its vassals and about how oppressive they are is when they do something that is not in line with the foreign policy establishment and the neocons and neoliberals, all of them. That's the only time that there's a problem.
That's true. And, and it points out something else about the Biden administration. These are people who are just not very smart. They, who doesn't have issues with the Saudi state, right? But being friends with the Saudis has been a mainstay of U.S. foreign policy for decades. And every American president, regardless of party, Democrats, Republicans, whatever they say about Saudi human rights, the U.S. and the Saudis were always friends. But the Biden team, being who they are, a bunch of amateurs, they fall out with them because why? Because OPEC won't act like the Europeans have and shoot themselves in the feet. So the U.S. wants them to pump more oil, and they're saying, no, actually, the whole point of having a cartel is to make money, right? So that wouldn't serve their interests at all. And so they said no, and then they became public enemy number one, which brings up another point. Everything the U.S. does to try to enhance its hegemonic power ends up hurting them in some kind of way. So I have this, nobody has a crystal ball or knows what's going to happen. But this, and Ukraine crisis, lest we forget, began in 2014 when the Obama administration chose sides and with the right wing in Ukraine and drove out the elected president in a coup. That was supposed to help the West, but it's just devolved. Now there's an open shooting war. We're at the verge of a hot war between the U.S. and Russia. And so we're being led by people who quite literally do not know what they're doing, who are smashing everything that they can, and in the end and we don't know how this will be. They are only going to hurt themselves and hurt us, the people who live under their governance. But this is a very dangerous time because of the people that are in power now who are so short-sighted, so stupid, and will bring about some unknown terrible things. And I can't trust them. So who was the one talking about nukes? Biden, not Vladimir Putin. Putin didn't say anything about nukes. It's our president, who's not a well man, talking about nuclear Armageddon, babbling, whenever I don't know, I feel like he needs a nap sometimes or something. But this is a problem we're in. It's the nature of the state at this time, and also worsened by the individuals who happen to be running things right now.
Garland, I wanted to let's talk about China now and in Taiwan. Let's begin with Taiwan, and then maybe we can transition and close out on these protests, which seem to be fizzling out across China. And there's some updates I can share. But let's first start. You recently, I was watching you on Rockfin talk about Taiwan, and that was right before, I believe, these election results came out. So local elections happened in the municipalities and the counties in Taiwan, and the Democratic Progressive Party, which is Tsai Ing-wen, president or whatever she is, she is the head authority in Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen. Her party, which is a pro-independence, pro-separatist party, just got laid a smackdown in these local elections. Taipei is no longer under DPP control. And I believe, let's see, what are the numbers here? I believe it was something like out of 21 posts for these city mayors, the KMT, which was which is the Nationalist Party, they won 13 of them. And so now they have something like 70% of the population within their districts. And Tsai Ing-wen had to step down as head of the party. And while she will serve out, I think, another 2 years as the head authority of the island, she will that party is likely in a lot of trouble unless they can stir up something to change their political fortunes. But it's a huge deal because and I find it quite interesting that these protests, especially the ones in Shanghai, which had anti-regime and pro-regime change, like anti-China messages, anti-Xi Jinping, pro-regime change messages in Shanghai, they were happening at the same time that this was happening in Taiwan. I find it very curious, very, very good timing, because no one was talking about this, and it potentially spells doom for the US's policy of waging kind of a Ukraine-like proxy war against China via Taiwan. So, Garland, what are your thoughts about this? Because, of course, we're talking about the one China policy. Where this comes amid Biden and Xi's talk at the G20. There's been a lot of indications, and it's not just Taiwan, it's not just China, that there is like a lot of divides. They talk about NATO unity and unity between the US and Europe. But there's a lot of divisions here. There's a lot of what's the best way to go about it. A lot of European countries are trying to cool it with China because they need the business. If they don't get the business this winter from China, that's like a double whammy of having no energy and no commodities flowing. That sounds like a recipe for complete collapse, let alone an economic crisis. And the United States is also hedging their bets, wondering how aggressive to be with China at this time, given the delicate situation happening with Ukraine. So what are your thoughts about all these developments, and especially in regard to Taiwan?
Well, one of the interesting things about Taiwan, I'm glad I get to report on that a lot, very, very often, like almost daily, pretty much on China. And when Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, the United States, the Western media didn't report the protest. They didn't report there was like a bomb threat at her hotel and near her hotel. There were people in the street holding signs. Then when she went to South Korea, the South Korean president was like staying 20 minutes from where she was. He wouldn't come see her. He was afraid. He stayed away from her. His numbers are down. So what I see here is the U.S. Media does a good job of hiding the truth from us often, but that doesn't affect the truth. So they were able to hide from the American people who weren't able to dig down and see that there was protest and unhappiness. And the people in Taiwan were saying, we don't want to be Ukraine 2.0. We can see how that turns out. They may have hid it from us, but the time came for voting, and the people of Taiwan, who are very comfortable with a status quo. Also, and this is something that's not being reported, the people of Taiwan, a lot of people are very angry. Their crown jewel is TSMC. Their crown jewel is this, a chip making plant of all chip making plants. They got it. That's what makes things work for Taiwan. And the U.S., when Tsai Ing-wen working together, is like moving the most highly technical part, that's like I think 3 nanometers or less chips, to Arizona. So the U.S. is doing the same thing to Taiwan, and that's what they do to their vassals, that they're doing to Europe. They're going in there and saying, man, that's a nice chip making plant you got. Why don't we just take that and move that here? And of course, Tsai Ing-wen's like, sure, whatever you want, doesn't matter. Well, though the people in Taiwan were noticing that, they weren't happy with that. The U.S. Media is not going to report on that. But now it's being clear. It's clear the people have voted and they don't want to go in that direction. And I suspect they're going to continue in that direction. And by the time the 2 years is up, I mean, this, as you said, this plan for Taiwan to be Ukraine 2.0 has just flopped. It has just fallen. The people of Ukraine, the people of Taiwan have said no, which also means this, that the Chinese government can now look at it and say, we're actually aligned with the people of Taiwan. So Kevin McCarthy, who said monkey see, monkey do. Oh, as soon as I get in power, if he does, the first thing I'm going to do is go to Taiwan, because Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan. Well, now the Chinese people, the Chinese government can simply say, you guys do whatever you want. You can play all the games. You can run back and forth to Taiwan. You can do all of the things that are supposed to offend or upset us. But guess what? We got the Taiwanese people. We're just going to keep our powder dry. In 2 years, there'll be someone in charge, and we will continue to work out this one China thing. Sorry, the jig is up. That ain't working. And I suspect long before then, probably within the next few months, this Ukraine thing's going to fall apart. My prediction for that is collapse. And the two are working together, because as Russia is involved in a kinetic war against the U.S. empire, clearly Russia and China are working together for what the diplomatic end of it, where they're going around the world, they're making friends, they're building BRICS and SCO. You know, you can't separate China and Russia now when you look at what they're doing diplomatically and economically, how they're building coalitions. They are working together very, very broadly throughout the world. And they're using, basically, when it comes, there's a diplomatic war. And the way I would put it is the U.S. is using the iron fist diplomatically around the world, threatening, Africa, whoever, and China and Russia together are using a velvet glove, making friends, giving people wheat, things of that nature. And I think we know how that works. One other thing I'd have to say, one last thing, India, very important. And here's what and here's why India has no choice but to side with Russia and China. India aspires to be a world power. They're already looking at saying, wait a minute. We know that if we start to rise like Russia and China, the U.S. is going to be on our border within Kashmir, whatever the hell. They'll find someplace. They're going to be on our border. They're going to be pumping weapons in. They know the game, that if they start to rise like they would like to, that the U.S. is coming after them next. So they have no choice. Any country that aspires to be a world power or even a regional power has to side with Russia, China, India, because they're looking at the future, and they know if they don't, they got the crosshairs right between their eyes.
Oh, Margaret is. Oh, there you go.
Yeah. Everyone, it's a funny thing about being the bully. The bully can win. You can beat up the other kids on the block, but everybody else notices how that is done. And it goes back to the point I was making earlier about every move the U.S. makes to increase its power hurts it in some other way. So India, as you said, wants to be a world power. All this cajoling, trying to get them not to buy Russian oil, it's just stupid. And that's what I meant about these people. First of all, India, they already screwed themselves when the U.S. told them to stop buying Iranian oil. So they did themselves in once, and then along comes a new nincompoop in the White House saying, don't buy oil from that one. And they're like, actually, no, we're going to buy oil from whoever we want. Thank you very much. So you have this hope that countries are stupid or will do themselves in when they have a vested interest in siding with this other pole. And there is a multipolar world. You can't change it. You can't end it. And this fantasy that they can break up Russia, or, Putin will be kicked out of power, Xi Jinping is going to be kicked out of power, it's just nonsense. But I think, unfortunately, there are people in Washington who, really believe their own hype, who really think so. But the Indias of the world are telling them that that's not true. But that's the danger that these people pose to us. Even as we can see, it's very clear that countries that have independence, that are not vassals, are moving towards that other pole and away from the United States. So we will see how this is going to turn out, and exactly how the U.S. is undermining itself.
If
Well,
I may, one
yep.
more thing. So the U.S. Recently has started this chip war against China, where they're passing these laws so that that U.S. companies can't sell chips to China, and it is spectacularly backfiring. They've had tens. At last I heard 30 or 35,000 layoffs in Silicon Valley. So the U.S. in these crazy ideologues are doing to their own country what they're doing to Europe. They're like screwing over our technology sector. In all of this is a mad grasp to say, oh no, we're losing unipolar power and hegemony. We've got to hold on to it. It's kind of like the little girl with the rabbit kind of story, where her parents buy her a rabbit, and on the way home in the car, she loves the rabbit and she hugs the rabbit so tight that by the time she got home, she smothered the rabbit. And that's what they're doing. They're trying to hold on to hegemony so tight. They're squeezing it. No, you've got to give me that. You've got to do that. And as Margaret said, they're smothering it out by trying to hold on to it so hard.
I want to, as we train, because I definitely want to close, I know we want to try to keep this at 90 minutes. So I want to just add to that before getting into these protests that a lot of people have been asking to cover here. So I thought it would be good to comment. I do have a couple of threads on Twitter, not long, so we should be able to get through them in about a minute. I'll just quickly read through them. And then the Global Times actually published today an article that we won't read through, but we can just show to say that there have been responses to these protests and pretty positive ones. But I wanted to just say, to your point, Garland, especially as we transition into talking about these protests in China, is that there is something very convenient about this. It reminds me of 2019 Hong Kong, when China was rising. A lot of the propaganda against it wasn't working. It was moving toward ending extreme poverty. Donald Trump administration, its trade war, all of that was massively backfiring at that time. And then suddenly Hong Kong was happening, and there were these so-called massive protests that were supposedly genuine. Then you find out that they're all NED backed, and that there was a real conspiracy to try to peel Hong Kong, as had been happening for many years in China, to try to peel Hong Kong from China, using democracy as the pretext. Now, China's had quite a successful period, not just the Taiwan elections, which is very good news for the One China principle, but it also had a lot of successful diplomatic exchanges at these big summits, the G20, the ASEAN summit. I mean, Xi Jinping humiliated Justin Trudeau, and I know, Margaret, you cover that, humiliated him. And it wasn't just that, though. It was a successful conversation with Joe Biden, literally looking like the adult in the room. Joe Biden talking about Uyghurs and all of this, and Xi Jinping is like, do what you say you do. If you say you're for the One China principle, you have to show us. Really looking like the world leader that China has become, and Asia, really, the whole continent in these summits, just really demonstrating how aligned they are with China. And then you also have, at the same time, the divided NATO, divided Europe. A lot of European countries, from Germany to France, saying, oh, China, we need to work with you. And then now you have disagreements about the Ukraine situation. So suddenly now everyone's talking about COVID in China again, right? Like, now there's these protests happening, and everyone's like, wow, these are so genuine. And look, it's, all the cold warriors in the media are like, look, this is all about, democracy. And even Naomi Klein, right? All these like, like State Department leftists, right? They're talking about how this is such a popular uprising. How great is it? Well, I just want to show you this thread by someone who's been doing some really good work on covering this. And then I definitely want your guys' reactions to close out. So here's just a brief thread by someone, Zhao Dashuai, and they talk about an overview, right? So here's a video. I won't play the sound to the video, but basically this is in Chengdu, and there's a small group of people chanting, "We want freedom," in Mandarin. And this is very important because China, even though there's a standard language, like a national language, there's a lot of dialects, not to mention a lot of other nationalities that speak other languages as well. But someone's chanting, "We want freedom" in Mandarin, and then someone in Sichuan, which is the local dialect in this region, says, "F your freedom." So basically, this person is saying that the vast majority of people want COVID policy to change. That yes, COVID policies have been stringent. There have been some excesses around testing, so for example, and that there's a small minority of people using this as a stepping stone for regime change, and that people are working directly with foreign journalists, Western journalists, and their voices are being overrepresented. And so this person was on Telegram groups, and I don't want to hear about, oh, you can't get Telegram in China. the most people in China know how to use VPN. So this person was on Telegram and said, look at all of these people in this group organizing protests. Here you have Radio Free Asia, New York Times journalists, Epic Times journalists, which is Falun Gong, right-wing cult, CNN, Associated Press. You have them literally organizing a protest right outside of the Starbucks. Here's the time. Here's the translation. That's what they were doing. And these journalists work with professional protesters to set the narrative. Once the narrative is set in your mind, everything you tend to follow, their train of thought. This is how, I think there's some translation issues, but basically they were listening to them talk on this Telegram group, these professional protesters, about what they were going to do. And so most active people in that group are not in China. One person described herself as an activist from overseas. And there's a clear divide between the reasonable majority and the tiny minority with ulterior motives. And so after this wasn't too long ago. This was as it was starting, November 27th. I'm just going to show one. It's like literally a 2-second thread. So let me just exit out of this. I want to show you what's been happening since then. Because this person who did a good job scouring Chinese social media and other things to show that the protests in China seem to be fizzling out faster than a wet firecracker. And here's Guangzhou, 5 protesters being scolded by locals as the police and onlookers enjoy the show. Here's what they said. We won't play it. Basically, they were saying that a local person says, "Are you even from Guangzhou? You're not here to help us. You're here to create trouble. We Cantonese are very generous. If you need money, we can give you some," implying that they are being paid by foreign forces. And then some of you may not know this, but Chinese people's tolerance for foreign-backed protests is very below zero. The century of humiliation is deeply entrenched. And then you have people giving the middle finger to these protesters. So obviously, this isn't some kind of panacea of freedom-loving people coming out. There's a lot that we have yet to know. There's a lot that we have to learn, but we should just be very suspicious when so many things are happening around the world, and China is playing this really interesting leadership role. And suddenly, as a lot of developments get hot, like with Taiwan, big change there, with these summits, suddenly now there's like a color revolution kind of thing happening in China around a policy, mind you, which, people are saying, "Oh, well, Danny, what about the COVID policy?" Well, that's, first of all, China is China, and China will handle COVID and handle a lot better, mind you, than the United States has. But here you have today, the Global Times says epidemic control measures should be lifted in a timely manner to minimize inconvenience to the people, the National Health Commission says. Now, I read the article, and what it's saying is not that they're going to lift them fully, but that they're going to make sure that any excesses in the policy are taken care of, because there were some excesses in certain places. There were some people angry about what happened in Willamuchi and Xinjiang with the fire, that some people attributed delays because of testing and being able to address that situation. But I want to stop now and just kick it to you first, Garland, and then Margaret, your reactions to what's been going on, and anything you'd like to say about this development, which I know a lot of people have been following quite closely in the last few days.
A couple of things. Number one, the obvious, and that is, we're told that the Chinese people can't protest, that it's a totalitarian society. Oh, they're not allowed to protest. They'll all be machine gunned down and immediately run over by tanks. But now we're told, well, they're protesting all over the place. They're in the streets. They're doing whatever they want to, but they're not allowed to protest at the same time. That's number one. Number two, I remember watching protests in like Berlin and France, and they were like beating the hell out of the protesters and, abusing them, dragging them across the street. I mean, they really were being mercilessly beat. So I find it interesting that the same people who were in favor of lockdowns here were in favor of literally, like, if the unvaxxed should be put in prisons and, dungeons and what have you, the people who were in favor, and this is not to say I'm for or against any COVID policy. I'm just saying these people were in favor of stringent COVID policies here. And they were in favor of suppressing anyone who wanted to protest against COVID policies here. And now they have completely done a 180 on China and saying, yay, they're fighting against COVID policies. And, they should be able to protest all over the place. It's interesting to watch this 180, and, you've got to laugh at it and say, they're, exposing themselves. But here's the other part of it. It kind of reminds me of the infamous Bay of Piglets in Venezuela, where a bunch of schmucks kind of tried to 60 idiots tried to come in and overthrow the country on like 18-foot Boston whalers, and literally they lost the war to fishermen. A bunch of fishermen took them out, and they thought they were going to take out the Venezuela army, and they lost a gunfight with fishermen. The pathetic attempts at regime change. We had Kazakhstan. We've got their fomenting a bunch of unrest in Iran. The world is hip to them. Everybody knows in every country, when they start seeing some protests kick up, they're like, uh-oh, they're at it again, guys. It's going to be a bit of an inconvenience. We're going to have to deal with it. But these morons from Washington, D.C. are starting the old color revolution thing. They think it's going to work. When was the last time it worked? It didn't even work in Syria. Now, they tore Syria up and killed a lot of people, but it didn't work. So the bottom line is, they don't even know. I mean, it's a good thing. They don't even know how to do regime change anymore. The only thing they know is, hey, let's start some protests somewhere and we'll get the people going and they'll all protest. What then? Oh, we haven't figured that part out. But let's get the protests going and we'll try to figure out. They have protests. So unfortunately, there's violence. Some people get killed. Whatever country it is, tampons quells the protest, and then they go on about their business. China, it's going to be an inconvenience. It's going to be a burr under their saddle for a couple weeks. The protests are going to go away, and then they're going to go on about their business. They're humoring the neocons for a couple weeks, but this is going nowhere. Let me add this. You know why? Because this is another example. At least the government in China somehow responds to the people. The people, we're unhappy with this. Okay, we'll do something. The government in Europe, the governments in the United States do nothing to respond to the people. If they get a little bit of response, that's a whole lot more than they get here.
You're muted, Margaret. Sorry.
Thank you. I keep muting myself and then I can't unmute. You're absolutely right, Garland, that first of all, whenever we see protests anywhere in the world, you have to wonder if the U.S. is involved. You have to ask yourself. So even in Iran, I'm sure people were angry about the young lady who died apparently of natural causes when she was in police custody, and there are people who want to get rid of those rules about women's dress. I'm sure that's true, but the U.S. is always involved. Any unrest in Iran, you can bet that the U.S., and you win the money, that the U.S. has some involvement. You always have to, no matter how much you may agree with people somewhere else. And and as I said before, I want everybody to be able to influence their government to get what they want. But even when people are trying to speak out against something that's in their interest, you have to always ask yourself what the U.S. is doing. You have to, because 9 times out of 10, the U.S. is involved. And there aren't any protests in Hong Kong or Shanghai, or, if anybody in Taiwan says, I don't like the, Communist Party of China, you better believe that the U.S. has a hand in it. But you mentioned something else when you mentioned the Bay of Piglets. So the Trump administration says they're going to use maximum pressure and they're going to get rid of the government of the elected government of Venezuela. So they turned out the lights. They had power outages. They had acts of sabotage, starved the country with sanctions. And what's happened now? They just gave Chevron permission to do business in Venezuela. Why? Because they screwed themselves by cheating themselves out of Russia's energy, and now they need Venezuela's oil. And I'm glad that they do, actually. So you see these people, and I just have to say also, Biden was supposed to be harm reduction and everything, and he followed every Trump foreign policy to the letter, and in fact made them worse. But this is the result. This is what I was talking about before. Every effort to practice hegemony, every effort to smash people somewhere else in the world inevitably reverberates. And now the U.S. has in fact given its blessing to the Venezuelan government, meeting with the opposition. Every time they tried to do it in the past, the U.S. would put the kibosh on it. And now it's happening because the U.S. cannot continue with this policy that they have been practicing for so long. Venezuela has just declared they are fully socialist. That is their goal, to have a socialist country. They are allied with China and with Russia. So the U.S. has once again undermined itself. I'm glad these people are undermining themselves, but this is always going to be the result of these crazy schemes to where they think they can control the entire world.
If I may add, there's something you guys don't know because I'm in DC. I first started noticing it. I'm not much in DC, that much on the weekends, or not over near the areas where the White House and those kind of areas. I may be in somewhere where people are hanging out having fun. But I'm coming from the Assange protest a few weeks ago, and I go by one square, and there's like the MEK anti-Iran kooks. They're out there, and it's obvious a U.S. State Department, like the whole square. There's all these nice new gigantic flags, and they've got really good-looking banners, and they're cheering stuff, anti-Iran stuff, right? And then you go like a couple squares down, and it's China, and a couple years, and it's like, so literally they are like taking these little squares in DC where it's like a little park in between four streets, and they'll just like have whichever country that think they're going to do regime change on, and they like pay for all the stuff, all this brightly colored stuff, and a bunch of nutcases out there chanting stuff. And I look at it and I'm like, what's the point of that? Do you think the people in China are sitting there like, hey man, there's a bunch of people in Farragut Square at 16th and K standing out there with banners chanting anti-China stuff? I guess we better abandon Beijing and hand it over to the U.S. These people are, like, as you said, Margaret, they're idiots. I think they reflexively do this stuff, and they don't even know why they're doing it anymore. And the people in China are like, what are you going to do? I don't know. Let's go to Africa and make some more friends and build like a highway or something, and then we can do trade with these people. And these idiots are on the squares of DC chanting crazy idiot stuff.
Yeah, and maybe I could close or with your thoughts on this, because you said, Garland, it's idiot. It's idiot stuff. It's idiotic. Like, when you see the NED like literally at work on your block, basically the National Endowment for Democracy, literally staging sham protests that no one in the countries that are being targeted care about. But of course, it's all about building a campaign. I think the important thing is that we cannot get pulled into the idiocy, because a lot of, unfortunately, the so-called left, but this does have an effect on people, because what happens is that AP, CNN, they're literally in China, Radio Free Asia. They probably, I don't know, they were in Hong Kong, and they hitched a ride, because you can do that in China. You can you can move from place to place quite easily. Hitched a ride to Shanghai, hitched a ride to Beijing, and not Beijing, to like Chengdu and these places, and started to try to foment stuff. So with that said, it's important that we don't get pulled and sucked into the idiocy, because that's what they want from us. They want us to sign. So when we see the Associated Press, CNN, any of these mainstream media outlets start to praise protests, I don't know if you remember when 2020 was happening, Kamala Harris and in the New York Times, they were calling people protesting police brutality Russians. That's Russia, right? Colin Kaepernick, oh, he's a Russian asset. How many times, right? Everyone, all of them.
Truckers in Canada, Vladimir Putin was driving the trucks, according to them.
Any kind of protest that isn't liked, and a lot of most of them that happen in the West are not convenient to the ruling class. So they are then, I mean, look at what Julian Assange. Julian Assange, he's not a protester, but he's a journalist. All he did was do what journalists do: leak information that the public should know about war crimes, about corruption, Democratic Party corruption. And now he's at risk of dying in prison or being lynched in a U.S. prison if he's extradited, whichever comes first. Like that's the trajectory. Even though the New York Times now is saying, well, maybe we shouldn't do that. The fact of the matter is, the New York Times, the mainstream media, whenever they praise protests, we should be very suspicious abroad. Whenever they're praising protests in Iran, in China, anywhere, Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, whenever they're doing that, we should be thinking, well, who is behind that? Who is trying to steer protests? Who is literally trying to generate protests to undermine the multipolar world? Because that's what really color revolutions are all about: undermining sovereignty, undermining China and Russia's alliance, undermining the ability for global South countries to develop independently of U.S. hegemony. Because, as you say a lot, Garland, there's a long history of this, right? People in Venezuela, people in China, people all around the world, people in Russia, they remember what it was like to be under the yoke of some form of Western domination, whether it was colonialism, neoliberal shock therapy like in Russia, the century of humiliation like in China. They know. So whenever we hear, that's the one point I want to make, and then I want to get your guys' response to this. The mainstream Western media talking about these protests are great. We should be thinking, what's going on here? That's what we should be asking ourselves before we say, oh yeah, well, we don't like COVID policies, so like COVID policy like China has, so we're against that, so we're for the protests. Or like in Venezuela, oh, I heard that they're a dictatorship or something authoritarian. Now that there's protests and the media likes them, then I like them too. It seems to be how a lot of the left thinks, and I just want to know what your thoughts are about this.
Yeah, I'm with you 100%. I'm far more cynical than that now. As soon as I see the protests and as soon as I see the U.S. media say something positive, I'm like pretty much cut and dried. Like, okay, it's another one of those color revolutions. I'm not suspicious of it. In fact, as soon as I see protests break out anywhere, I'm like, hey, was that a protest I saw somewhere in whatever country it was? And as soon as I see it's a protest, then I start waiting, looking around. Is the media all over that? If the U.S. media is like, hey, we don't like those protests, I'm like, probably some pretty good stuff there. They're doing the right thing. They're opposed to it, So yeah, it's gotten clear. And the other part of it is this: look at the country. Is it a country that has an independent economic or independent foreign policy? If there's protests and let's face it, there are protests that are organic in countries. That people protest, wonderful. They ought to. I wish they'd protest more here. But they take the organic protests and try to put some spice in it. And you can see what happens as they start to twist it into, this is a dictatorship. The government must be overthrown, and maybe they should pump all their oil and give it to the U.S. There's going to be like a banner somewhere. Yes, down with the dictators, resources to the U.S.
I'm back. Okay. So you are absolutely right. And actually, this is what I'm writing about this week in Black Agenda Report. Protest that is deemed worthy or unworthy. And of course, the worth depends upon how the United States feels about it. And that's unfortunate because, we should all want people to have their rights respected, to have the lives that they want for themselves. But that's not what the U.S. wants. The U.S. wants countries to do what it wants them to do, and otherwise to hell with you. And let's talk about what they're doing in some European countries. The UK is about to pass a bill that will pretty much make it illegal to have any kind of meaningful protest at all. So while they may talk about authoritarians here or there, or China or Iran, they should look in the mirror first. And that's another thing. What we were always told was totalitarian is becoming more and more common in the Western nations, and not in these nations that are portrayed as the boogie men and boogie women of the world. So I say everybody protest, but we just have to be honest and be aware of what our government does.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, on that note, we are heading toward the 90-minute mark. And so, you know, I think we can close it up here. Thank you so much, Garland, for joining us this evening. Of course, it's always great to be with you, Margaret. Just a few things. One, it's Giving Tuesday, so you have 3 journalists here who are very independent. You can subscribe to Black Agenda Report, so go there, blackagendareport.com. Definitely donate there. You can support this channel at Patreon, patreon.com/Dhaiphong. And of course, you can find Garland Nixon on all his platforms, and you can support him there. With that said, though, everyone, have a good night. And I will be back with you again very soon. Take care.
Bye bye.